As a student at Vanderbilt, I've had friends and classmates who have asserted that there cannot possibly be absolute truth, because in our modern world there are too many competing worldview claims. Some have argued that truth must be relative, yet these same students will boldly claim that war is an injustice and people deserve to be treated humanely. Where are these moral claims coming from if they aren't based on a religious belief? Today, many atheistic and agnostic thinkers use a framework called secular humanism, which asserts that human rights, justice, and love are fundamentally real aspects of humanity. However, they are not based on any religious basis. In a time when many college students at Vanderbilt University view rationality and secular reason as the bedrock of academic thought, what could religion possibly have to offer them? Could it be that Christianity, a 2,000-year-old religion, might actually have the answers to some of their deepest questions? Questions such as, when is personal freedom harmful? Why can't I define my own identity? And how should I respond to injustice? Join me as we go into the root issues beneath these questions and explore how Tim Keller's 2016 book, Making Sense of God, seeks to address the questions that secular people are asking about religious belief.
And here's the thesis. To move from religion to secularism, to move from religious faith to secular belief that there is a God, no God, or maybe there's no God. So to move from religious faith to secularism is not so much a loss of faith as a shift in a shift to a new set of beliefs, to a new community of faith, where the lines between orthodoxy and heresy are just drawn in different places.
Timothy Keller was a renowned pastor who preached at Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York City, which allowed him to minister to a diverse congregation of people, including skeptics to Christianity. His books have become New York Times bestsellers and have crossed over from the religious audiences to the mainstream. Part of what makes Keller's work so compelling is how he approaches secular audiences with a real genuineness and ability to see their deepest needs. In this book particularly, Keller diagnoses some of the deepest issues facing what he calls secular humanism and addresses how it has attempted to create a worldview apart from religion. This humanist worldview has core beliefs about human value, equal rights, and purpose, yet claims to derive all of these concepts from naturalistic means. In Keller's view, secular humanism falls short because, quote, humanistic beliefs of most secular people should be recognized as exactly that, beliefs. They cannot be deduced logically or empirically from the natural material world alone. If there is no transcendent reality beyond this life, then there is no value or meaning or anything, end quote. At Vanderbilt University, few students are directly asking whether or not there is a God. They want to know whether free speech should be encouraged versus where it should be limited on college campuses. They are grappling with their chosen identities as opposed to the different labels society gives them, and are trying to figure out who they are. Students at Vanderbilt are seeing injustices perpetrated all over the world and even in their own country, and they want to have a voice. Although these questions are more concrete than philosophical ideas about theism or religion, they find their grounds in the deepest, most human questions of all. How do we make sense of the fact that we live in a world where pain and injustice are prevalent? Where do our morals come from if there is no God? And if there is he the Christian God? These are just some of the root issues which Tim Keller addresses in Making Sense of God. I will be seeking to uncover the deeper issues from the current questions students are asking on my campus. This is Making Sense of God meets Vanderbilt University. Vanderbilt University has had a long-standing practice of institutional neutrality, a policy since the 1960s which keeps them above political discourse while fostering dialogue. According to the university, institutional neutrality is, quote, the commitment our university leaders make to refrain from taking public positions on controversial issues unless the issue is materially related to the core mission and functioning of the university, end quote. It sounds simple enough. The university will let students and faculty speak about controversial topics, and they won't intervene. Many students and faculty, however, find the university's policy to be concerning and even harmful to the credibility of the institution. One of the clearest displays of student and faculty outrage towards the university comes from Vanderbilt's student-run newspaper, The Hustler. In the past semester, there have been no fewer than 3 guest editorials calling for the university to take a stand against the Trump administration's recent cancellation of research funding at both VUMC and Vanderbilt. They ask for students to call for, quote, the chancellor to make a public statement identifying this moment as one in which his tenet of institutional neutrality not only permits but demands action, not merely to protect our funding, but also to safeguard our values, end quote. In this guest editorial, VUMC representatives believe that academic freedom is at stake and is being threatened by the university's complacent view towards the Trump administration's demands. Freedom is clearly a core issue at stake here, but while the guest editorials argue for academic freedom to teach and research DEI-related subjects, some students want institutional neutrality to protect their freedom of speech.
Thank you for having me. It is so good to be here. Oh, there we go, finally. I was wondering where you were because I drove in and it's a little chilly outside. And the one thing I know about my liberal fan club is they don't like any sort of obstacles or physical difficulties. So I said, okay, there's no way they're going to be outside in the cold. They're going to be inside somewhere. So what are you protesting me for?
What you just heard was protesters trying to interrupt a recent Vanderbilt speaking event by Michael Knowles, the controversial conservative commentator. The protests were centered around Knowles' past rhetoric, which includes the phrase transgenderism must be eradicated, a call that student groups such as Vanderbilt Lambda have interpreted as inciting violence. Although the event continued after the protesters' interruption, the ensuing community responses were equally outraged. Vanderbilt student government released a statement that was, quote, criticizing Vanderbilt's policy of principled neutrality and Chancellor Daniel Diermeier's position on allowing free discourse to go where it will, end quote. Meanwhile, listen to Chancellor Diermeier explaining his views on institutional neutrality and civil discourse.
The problem that we're seeing often is that, and we see it certainly now in the whole Israel-Gaza drama, is that students are trying to go after each other, right? And that's where most of the difficulties come from right now.
We'll come back to the issues related to Israel's war in Gaza, but the crucial element of this section of the interview is how much freedom of expression is valued. Although those in favor, as well as those opposed to institutional neutrality, may appear to be polar opposites, they both have the same goal of achieving freedom, whether it is freedom of speech, expression, or ideas. A few minutes ago, I mentioned that Tim Keller's book, Making Sense of God, spoke to the deeper issues behind the questions people are asking. This holds true, especially in regards to the issue of absolute freedom. Chapter 6 of the book is entitled, Why Can't I Be Free to Live as I See Fit, as long as I don't harm anyone? And it is an apt summing of modern secular culture and how it views freedom. Keller answers this question by first dissecting the problems with making freedom the highest ideal. Here's Tim Keller speaking about freedom during his talk at Google in 2016.
Modern culture defines freedom as the absence of restrictions. Isaiah Berlin, the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, said there's 2 kinds of freedom. There's negative freedom, there's positive freedom. Negative freedom is freedom from. Positive freedom is freedom for. Negative freedom simply says, I'm only free if I have no restrictions at all. And I hope you all know that means if that's really what freedom is, then that is antithetical to love. Because the more committed your love relationship is, the less free you are. And yet, by the way, the more you are in a wonderful, committed love relationship, generally, the happier you are. The fact is, we've got a culture and a belief set that doesn't support positive freedom. It only supports negative freedom. And as a result, freedom actually tends to eat up love relationships. And it's one of the reasons why we have fewer and fewer lifetime committed love relationships, because the view of freedom that comes from highly individualistic view that goes along with the secular view undermines that.
In his view, love, rather than freedom, should be the ultimate goal. If we are only seeking our own liberation from restriction, what he refers to as negative freedom, then we will find it impossible to commit to a loving relationship. Another issue Keller addresses is that we often have competing desires that would come into conflict with one another if we tried to pursue both of them. On Vanderbilt's campus, this plays out when protesters want to silence speakers who use speech they disagree with, while simultaneously defending their own protesting on the grounds of free speech. It is not enough to become an absolutist in defense of all kinds of freedom. Our lives naturally have limits and constraints despite how we might choose to live. Keller writes that, quote, "You then are not free to do whatever you choose. That is an impossible idea and not the way freedom actually works. You get the best freedoms only if you are willing to submit your choices to various realities, if you honor your own design." End quote. Clearly, freedom without limits is not a good within itself. So how should we balance freedom and love? The alternative to pursuing negative freedom at the cost of relationships with others is to pursue a relationship with Jesus, the giver of life itself. For Christians, God's law is not a confining rule that restricts our liberty. Rather, it is the, quote, "list of God's loves and hates by which we can please him and come to be like him," end quote. For us to be in relationship with God, we have to give up some of our old patterns of living. But this is actually freeing because these ways of sinful living were actually causing us to suffer. Freedom, particularly freedom of speech, is a widely debated subject on Vanderbilt's campus. In the past 2 years, the discussion has become more heated in the wake of mass college protests surrounding the war in Gaza. Many students want to know, how do we respond to injustice?
Those who were there call it shocking and disappointing. At least 26 Vanderbilt University students ended up in handcuffs after protesting on campus.
And this week, several students now face possible expulsion on top of legal troubles. News 2's Maya Owens with the latest.
The protest inside Vanderbilt University started after school administrators removed a proposed amendment to the Vanderbilt Student Government Constitution. It would have prevented student government funds from going to certain businesses that support Israel. This is what democracy looks like. But it quickly turned into dozens of students handcuffed, removed from the building.
One of the most polarizing issues on college campuses came to a head at Vanderbilt when students broke into Kirkland Hall, an administration building, during a pro-Palestinian protest. For weeks leading up to this day, student activists in the Vanderbilt Divest Coalition have been protesting the use of Vanderbilt student government funds being used for companies they saw as allied with Israel. The protesters who broke into the building were ultimately suspended from the university, and several were taken into custody for assaulting a security officer and breaking a window upon their forced entry. The Vanderbilt Divest Coalition's official statement on the university response to the protest was as follows, quote, "They are admitting that they do not value protests as a legitimate form of political action, and only permit protests as they see fit. This is consistent with their lies about their support for free speech," end quote. Vanderbilt, meanwhile, responded by stating that, quote, "Some students physically assaulted a community service officer to gain entrance and proceeded to push staff members who offered to meet with them," end quote. The students who protested claimed that this was misinformation by the university. The central thesis of secular humanism is that there are fundamental human rights that must be respected, and fighting for social justice is ultimately a good for society. The students who protested Israel's war in Gaza did so because they believed that these fundamental human rights were being trampled upon, and the United States was letting it occur. Similar campus protests occurred all over the country last year, and the most striking of which were in Columbia's campus in New York City.
We're going to stay in New York City here for a moment. Columbia University is disciplining at least 70 students who participated in campus protests last year. Those protests, triggered by the conflict between Israel and Hamas, got nationwide attention. Now the university is going as far as expelling some of those students. Reporter Lisa Rosner has reaction from campus.
Columbia University says this demonstration at Butler Library in May affected hundreds of students attempting to study. A source from the university telling us 80% of the participants are being...
These protesters have faced arrest, suspension, and even expulsion, and yet they continue to advocate for Palestine. Here's what an opinion editorial in the Vanderbilt Hustler had to say about the crisis. Quote, Israel's response in Gaza to the October 7, 2023 attack has resulted in over 40,000 deaths, including over 13,000 children. The continuing escalation of violence in the region is unjustified. This makes ending the killing a moral imperative. End quote. It is important to note that this particular author calls for civility and peaceful protest, while still acknowledging the human rights cause the pro-Palestinian students are advocating for. Despite this call for civility, responses to this and other moderating voices have been outraged, calling their requests for peaceful protest myopic and accusing it of failing to address the injustice. Is it possible that there is a deeper layer to this story? It seems that beneath the anger towards Israel and calls for companies to be boycotted, there is a core desire to see injustice made right in the Middle East. Why is that so? The average American college student has never visited Israel or Gaza, and yet many are passionately convinced that there is a great wrong occurring there that they cannot ignore. Secular humanism's answer to suffering is that we have an innate biological or societal impulse to care when others are suffering. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 3, asserts that all people are entitled to, quote, the rights to life, liberty, and security of person, end quote. It seems so straightforward and simple, and yet there are still wars and people are still mistreated. Perhaps the issue isn't what the fundamental rights are, but why do they exist? In other words, what is the moral basis for justice? In Making Sense of God, Timothy Keller addresses the injustices we see across the world. Yet, he draws our attention to the fact that although the United Nations declares these rights, they are not truly universal. Quote, Western secularists insist that their view of human rights is simply obvious to any rational person, but non-Western cultures respond that they are far from evident. End quote. If we are to claim that rationality is the basis for our basic moral standards, this would imply that non-Western cultures are irrational, which harkens back to Western imperialist ideas. If human rights can't be based on rationality, then what do we base them on?
So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. I am here because I have organizational ties here. But more basically, I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so am I compelled
This
to
is
carry
Dr.
the
Martin
gospel
Luther
of
King
freedom
Jr. reading aloud his
beyond
letter
my
from a
own
Birmingham jail.
hometown.
He writes with the conviction that racism must be fought against in the United States because it is an injustice, not merely against humans, but against God's sacred law. If every person is made in God's image, then they are inherently worthy of rights and dignity. This is a much more stable foundation than a morality based on cultural norms which can vary depending on the time or place. In Timothy Keller's words, quote, the Bible gives us the strongest possible foundation for the idea of human rights. Your neighbor comes into your presence with an inherent worth and inviolable dignity, end quote. Through a Christian worldview, there are true answers to the questions of injustice and morality. Christians believe that God has established His law in the Bible, and it serves as the standard for perfection. In the words of Psalm 19, verses 8 through 9, quote, "The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The rules of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." End quote. God's law is a perfect standard of justice, meaning anyone who fails to obey it completely is guilty of breaking all of it. As humans, we are all sinners, meaning we have broken God's law and are deserving of death, the just punishment for our sins. It is the redeeming love of Jesus that has taken the punishment for our sins, so that justice could fall unto God's own Son rather than ourselves. Thus, ultimate justice can be seen in God's plan for humanity. Even so, those who reject a religious framework often claim that truth itself is a relative idea, something that no meta-narrative can determine. Instead, postmodernists favor so-called micro-narratives, where people can create their own truth that may be contradictory to others' truths. This postmodern worldview, ironically, becomes a meta-narrative of its own, however, as it defines what is acceptable versus what is outdated thinking. Keller writes that it divides the world into, quote, "a binary of white hats," those promoting plurality, multiple, local, changeable micro-narratives, and black hats, those espousing universal values, absolutes, and meta-narratives, end quote. In contrast to the universal values that provide no definite response to injustice, Christians such as Dr. King can place their faith in the fact that Jesus will bring justice to those deserving it. God's eternal plan means that eventually there will be no more pain or injustice when He makes the world new. If we are to follow Keller's logic and agree that belief is at the core of both religion and secular postmodernism, then our decision becomes, where should we place our belief? If absolute freedom and a justice with no moral basis fail to be worthy, then Christianity seems like the most obvious choice. For many college students, however, the issue is not with the outside world, it is within themselves. Many students want to be able to self-actualize their identity, to create it wholly themselves, without making their identity beholden to religious belief. Is there truly anything wrong with a self-defined identity? The secular identity is supposed to be freeing, because it is self-made and therefore beholden to no one. Unlike the ancient self, which was often defined by social class belonging to a specific religion, the modern person is free to choose how they want to live and thus who they want to be. Our modern Western culture teaches us that to find ourselves, it requires a process of introspection, looking within ourselves to define our identity. Timothy Keller addresses this in Chapter 6, The Problem of the Self, and writes that, quote, "The cultural message is this: don't try to get affirmation from others. Affirm yourself because you are doing what you want to do. Be who you want to be, and it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks." End quote. And he defines this mindset as expressive individualism. In theory, this way of living sounds endlessly liberating. If we don't have to trouble ourselves with what anyone else thinks, then we should be content with ourselves. But is that truly the case? Let's take a look at Vanderbilt's campus. In a Vanderbilt Hustler article entitled "To Meet and Greet or Sleep and Eat," a student considers her dilemma between constant socialization versus staying inside to prioritize her mental health. In poignant terms, the author expresses her feelings, quote, "There was surely something wrong with the fact that I was alone right now. At home, I thrived in my moments alone, craving them in fact. But here, I felt an inexplicable feeling of failure." End quote. Despite our culture telling us that we can make our identity entirely without the input of others, the reality seems to be the opposite. We crave others' affirmation. We also prioritize which desires we pursue based upon how others will perceive us. Timothy Keller explains that, quote, "Your self is defined by what one set of anyone's has to say. Our inner depths on their own are insufficient to guide us." End quote. Before we delve deeper into this idea of the independent self being insufficient for identity formation, we must consider another possible source of identity: success. In another Hustler article entitled "The Costs of Overachieving," the author, a former student, writes about how Vanderbilt students are put into a pressure cooker environment to succeed. She outlines how the competitive drive that enabled Vanderbilt students to get accepted into the university has resulted in an achievement mindset for many students. She writes how, quote, young people are told far too often that material success or being the best will make them happy, a message that destroys self-esteem and identity development, regardless of whether or not one achieves these goals, end quote. Clearly, this mindset is a pervasive issue at Vanderbilt, yet the cultural mantra to create your own identity often requires prioritizing competition at the expense of relationships. Ironically, creating oneself requires a constant need for external affirmation. Thus, it seems that the seemingly objective metric of achievement is not sufficient for identity formation. If there is always a new goal to achieve, then there is no sense of contentment or completeness.
The secular culture says you find your identity by looking inside and doing whatever you think you want to do most, and you assert it over and against everybody else. And lots of studies have shown that that kind of identity, which is really unique, it's not the way it works in the rest of the world or in history, makes you incredibly fragile because you desperately need a kind of recognition that it actually can enslave you.
That's Timothy Keller, discussing how the secular identity is ironically more cumbersome because it requires outside approval for validation. Being free to choose your own identity really just means, instead of having an identity that society gives you, you are desperate for society to validate what you have made for yourself. Another issue with expressive individualism is that you still have to decide which of your inner desires to express, as they may be in conflict with one another. Should we base our identities on our heart's deepest desires? According to the famed psychologist Sigmund Freud, our innermost being, which he called the id, is filled with, quote, unsociable chaos that would be dangerous if unleashed upon the world. He believed that our restraining superego, or conscience, is what keeps the id in check and allows us to live in harmony with others. Keller adds to this by noting that our desires are not even consistent with themselves and are subject to change. We cannot possibly base our identity on purely desires because they are much too destructive and shifting. What, then, should we base our identity upon? Remember that Vanderbilt Hustler article about students basing their identities on success? One line from that article stands out to me as the summation of the problems of the modern secular identity. The author is discussing the ramifications of students basing their identities on achievement and what occurs when they inevitably fail. Quote, when external success doesn't change internal security, they are left feeling like the imposter they always feared they were. End quote. Imposter syndrome. The feeling that you are a fraud who doesn't deserve to be at a school like Vanderbilt. This happens when a student spends their entire academic career chasing success, only to realize they cannot achieve everything. It sounds like a grim outcome, one with no real solution besides acknowledging one's own limitations. What if imposter syndrome was not a mental barrier, and instead it was a natural sign that we really cannot do it all on our own? While the Vanderbilt Hustler is the main source of student thought on campus, there is a student-run Christian journal called Synesis, which contributes a different perspective to wider discussions on campus. One article in particular, entitled Growing into Childhood, the Peace of a Given Identity, both addresses the achievement mindset and offers a potential alternative. The author states, rather bluntly, that, quote, jobs can be lost, education discredited, and legacies forgotten, placing the full weight of who we are on roles and achievements that can be stripped away by decisions and environments completely outside of our control is foolish, end quote. This highlights the dangers of building one's identity entirely upon success. What is the author's alternative? Rather than placing our identities in success, we should place them in Christ, our Creator. Earlier, we discussed how Dr. King was able to be assured that his cause was just because we as humans are created in the image of God. How much more assured, then, should we be in our identity? The author of the Synesis article puts it simply, quote, though every day we will fail to live perfectly, Christians can place their worth firmly in the identity that has been given by God, understanding that they certainly did not earn it by good deeds and achievements, and therefore cannot lose it by failures and shortcomings." End quote. Therefore, it isn't the success or lack thereof which defines us. It is our loving Father who has a perfect plan for our lives. Timothy Keller writes how, quote, "Unlike either traditional or secular culture, a Christian's identity is not achieved but received." End quote. This is an incredibly freeing realization that we don't have to base our identities on anything we do. It's all based on what Christ has already done for us. While researching for this project, I read dozens of opinion editorials and articles written by Vanderbilt students with vastly different concerns and questions they were considering. Even so, I found that all of them were asking deeper questions. In issues of freedom, there is always the question of when is a limitation on freedom actually a good for college campuses. In issues of social justice, there is the pervasive unease that results when we consider how no one really has a solution to end injustices. Finally, in issues of identity, there is never a clear guide to finding oneself or defining one's own identity that is entirely apart from societal standards or metrics of achievement. If I were to read these articles from a purely secular viewpoint, I would be left with a troubling feeling, perhaps an instinctual urge that something was wrong. Why aren't there solutions to these problems that confront Vanderbilt students in every university? Part of what makes college such a thrilling experience is the influx of new ideas and perspectives that allow students to think critically and question their preconceptions. Many college students who enter college with a religious background abandon it in favor of what to them is a more rational, secular humanism. If anything, I hope this episode has revealed that secular humanism is much less convincing than it appears. Without a moral grounding, and once the flawed concepts of universal or self-defined ethics are removed, there is no real standard for how we should live our lives and treat one another. In fact, Timothy Keller argues that it takes more faith than rationality to believe in moral precepts without believing in a God. Instead of a decision between straightforward rationality and so-called blind faith in religion, it is truly a decision between where we will place our faith. What does this mean for Christian students at Vanderbilt? It means that we should be having more conversations with our secular friends about the deeper questions they may be asking. Not every conversation has to be explicitly about faith, because our views on the topics of justice, morality, and identity are formed by our beliefs. In other words, let the conversations happen and our faith will shine through. Thank you for listening to Making Sense of God meets Vanderbilt University. No generative AI was used in the production of this episode. Special thanks to Seth Bollinger for audio assistance and script feedback. Thanks to the Vanderbilt Hustler and Vanderbilt Synesis for the use of their articles. My name is Micah Mayborn, and this is the Veritas Forum.